Dr. Harris, welcome to LSAT Unplugged.
Great to be here, Steve.
Thanks again for joining. So I always love speaking with you. It's always so informative. And I guess the biggest thing that students find interesting about what you have to say is that you've actually been on the other side at LSAC. You used to write actual LSAT prep test questions.
Right. Yeah, a long time ago, yes.
So I know we've had a few discussions like this in the past, and they've been well received. And I got some more questions from students that I thought I would throw your way and see what you think. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
Excellent. All right. So the first question is, has there ever been a question that you wrote for the LSAT that you ever looked back on and you thought was unfair in some way or tougher than you initially intended it to be?
Probably not, although I have no doubt that that was the case. Usually after I sent them off, I didn't give them that much more thought, but I know as a result of other test development projects that undoubtedly that was the case. And that's one of the nice things about having so many levels of editing with the LSAT. They do a really good job of smoothing out unexpected complications, et cetera.
I remember that one thing you said to me in the past is that you actually wouldn't even necessarily recognize a question that you had drafted because LSAC changes it so much.
Yeah, there are some times back when I was looking at some tests shortly after I wrote questions where I would have a sense of familiarity, but when I've actually met with some of the folks up there and seen what they've done to some of my questions, it was pretty clear that a lot of them didn't have a lot of similarity to what I had initially turned in.
That's really something. So what exactly do they change about it from the initial draft? Is it the topic? Is it a slight wording difference? Is it the method of reasoning, the question stem?
In my experience, now the ones that they've gone over with me, in my experience, they were usually, the stimulus wasn't changed too much. The topic would be pretty similar, but they might decide that, oh, this really isn't as a good idea for a weakener or a strengthener. Let's make it an assumption instead. Or maybe the stimulus is better suited for a sufficient assumption than a necessary assumption. So not huge changes. I mean, very often there would be editing to answer choices. Make a distractor more attractive, less tricky, whatever. That's mostly what I remember.
That makes a lot of sense. It seems to me also that the answer choices are kind of in a way the most difficult to write, and where the extra level of precision is kind of beyond what any single person could potentially do. It's kind of like it almost has to be done by committee or by a team.
It's so easy to overlook ambiguities too. Alternative readings of things that, you get stuck into looking at something a certain way and you just can't even see the other readings. So yeah, it's very helpful to have so many layers of editing. Yeah.
When you wrote LSAT questions, how did you start? Did you start with the stimulus?
It would depend. It really would depend. I mean, sometimes you'd read something, maybe I'd read something in a magazine or hear something on the radio that would suggest maybe a flaw. Sometimes, which comes first, the music or the words, right? It's that question. Everyone was different. I mean, yes, sometimes you would have an idea of what you wanted the key to look like. You had an idea as to, what flaw you wanted to exploit. And you'd have to come up with a stimulus to wrap around that. But more often than not, probably had a stimulus idea.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. When it comes to the LSAT as a whole, what makes you think the LSAT is a good exam or a valid exam or a fair exam, assuming that you think it's all those things? Why is it used? Why is it important? And of course, then on the flip side, we can get to a bit later, how does the GRE compare? But first, the LSAT.
Yeah, I think it is actually a pretty good test for a couple of reasons. First of all, they put a lot of care into its design and construction. You are really hard pressed to find an item that you don't think is valid if you go through their items. Secondly, I mean, I don't know how much time you spend hanging out with lawyers, but my experience is that they end up doing a lot of the kinds of stuff that the LSAT looks at. I mean, I think logical reasoning is just a masterful way to try to get at people's understanding of reasoning and natural language. I mean, I know lawyers who will spend a week arguing over the placement of a comma or a semicolon. The reading, I think, is so important too. The way the LSAT styles their reading comp. Games, I don't know how really important that is. It probably tells you something about somebody, but it seems to me that the logical reasoning especially, and the reading comp also, really get at what it is that most lawyers do, right, on a day-to-day basis.
So I guess the next question that comes to mind then is, let's say we were to remove the logic games section in our ideal modified LSAT test form. What might we add instead if we added anything? So let's say we had 2 logical reasoning sections and a reading comp section. Would you add more logical reasoning or something else altogether?
That's a great question. I've never even considered that. Excellent question. What do you think? What would you add?
Turning it back on me. I don't necessarily know either, but I just think it's fun to speculate about it a little bit. I'm thinking back to pre-1991. If you've seen those old LSAT items before the modern formation of the LSAT, they have this huge PDF. It's called something like a compendium of every type of LSAT question from 1948 to 1991. And they had general knowledge questions. They had sort of questions you might see on an IQ test with patterns.
Right.
And that sort of thing, or rearranging letters to make different words and stuff like that. And I don't know how valid that was, right? You see like in other countries, the common law admission test, like in India and the UK, I think in those exams, they have just random geography questions or capitals of nations and things like that.
I'm sure you select for something if you test for that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that those. You probably can select for people who went to certain schools and grew up in certain households. If you test general knowledge rather than some kind of more abstract ability as LR tests, although that probably doesn't fix it. That is to say, I'm sure that almost nothing correlates as strongly with LSAT scores as family income or et cetera, all the other things that people point to as evils of standardized tests. So
that's a great point. I did want to bring it around to that a little bit, because I do think that if we tested general knowledge or the capitals of different countries around the world and other sorts of general knowledge that people just absorb that is somewhat correlated with socioeconomic status, it seems to me that the LSAT is actually better than that alternative type of exam, because the skills the LSAT test, while they do correlate with income and things like that, the high school you went to, the college you went to, they're not really preparing you for this sort of exam from what I can tell. It's not testing math. It's not testing vocabulary in a straightforward manner. It's testing reasoning ability in these logic games. Most people haven't seen anything like that before.
Absolutely, and even if these things are correlated to socioeconomic status, nonetheless, these seem to be the skills that are relevant to the task. Whereas memorizing world capitals doesn't seem to be especially relevant to what kind of lawyer you're going to be. But recognizing a flaw in a ordinary language stimulus, that does seem to be relevant to what kind of lawyer you're going to be.
Yeah. Now I've seen that all the data suggesting that the LSAT as a whole correlates well with 1L grades, and they claim that from their analysis, I don't have the ability to fully dive into that, but their statistical analysis, they say that reasoning plus reading comp plus games is a better indicator than each one of those things in isolation. But it's all said to correlate with 1L grades. But of course, there's not really a clear way to measure performance as a lawyer, right? There's a much more ambiguous metric than a transcript, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I remember there were these folks over at, I think, Berkeley doing this project looking beyond the LSAT, where they were trying to come up with this alternative admissions test that was supposed to test some of the more human, softer factors that the LSAT doesn't test, but that doesn't really seem to have gone anywhere.
Yeah, I didn't hear about that. Trying to find the human side to lawyers, huh? I bet that is an interesting project.
Quite a project. Yeah, I'll have to send you the link on that. It's like 10 years old and it hasn't gone anywhere. But then on the flip side, surprisingly, the GRE has come around.
Yeah, we've talked about this in the past, and I don't think anybody's getting into law school by taking the GRE who wasn't getting in by taking the LSAT. I don't know what exactly the GRE is supposed to test. It's hard to see that it fits very well with any particular professional or graduate path. It's not like it tests math really, because all the math that it tests was something that you learned by 8th or 9th grade. It doesn't really test vocabulary anymore. It's hard to say really what the GRE tests, in my opinion.
Well, it's always looked to me kind of like it's just supposed to be a slightly more difficult version of the SAT, but maybe it's even not that.
Yeah, I think SAT math, I think it's way harder than the GRE math. I mean, I can see that there's some value in forcing people to do something unpleasant in order to establish some kind of commitment to this path. But other than that, it's not real clear to me what it tests. So.
Well, that's an interesting point, because I do think a lot of these standardized tests, so much of it is just seeing, can someone commit themselves to improving on something difficult? Can someone put in the work? Can they invest the time and make that, dedicate themselves to a difficult project that does involve some sort of book learning, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. MCAT, I'm not very familiar with it at all now that it's changed, but that seems to be a pretty reasonable test for physicians or prospective physicians. I mean, I imagine it is important that you know some organic chemistry, et cetera. So that seems, at least to be a reasonable test. But I don't know what the GRE is supposed to be testing. So anyway.
Have you looked at any of the data on the supposed claims about the GRE's correlation with 1L grades?
Very briefly. In fact, you sent me some links to some of that stuff that I read way back when. I forget. It seemed to me that there was some kind of statistical fallacy in their conclusions. Refresh my memory.
Yeah. They were looking. I know it was a couple of years back now when these changes first started happening. Harvard, once Harvard said they would take GRE scores, and a lot of other law schools followed suit. But Harvard was basically looking at top performers. Once again, someone who does well in the GRE also can inevitably do well in the LSAT if they're ending up at Harvard, right? Because they could probably do well in any standardized test you throw at them. And they also probably have a quite high socioeconomic status. So it is all tied together in the end.
They're desperate for students, law schools are. I think the bottom, we're pulling out of the bottom, I think. Test administrations are up for the LSAT. I think the number of matriculants has increased over the last couple of years. But I can see why, especially the most competitive schools, would want to do something to try to attract a larger pool of applicants. And so it would make sense for the Harvards, Michigans, Texases, or whatever to try to do this. But the beneficiary is those top tier schools, not the applicant, it seems to me.
Absolutely. Yeah. Any school taking the GRE, I guess, is benefiting in some way. They're getting more applicants. And so it's kind of good for them. They're getting more people coming through the door potentially.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
The crisis hasn't passed. If I'm not mistaken, an accredited law school or two has closed its doors over the last year or two. So I think that the crisis is still pretty acute. For many law schools, even if the number of students has started to tick back up. People ask me, is this a good time to go to law school? And I say, well, if you want to get in, it is. If you want a job, I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
But if you want to get in, it definitely is. So anyway.
Well, I guess law schools might have to start opening themselves up. Maybe they'll start taking the MCAT or the GMAT.
Well, speaking of tests that are on their last leg, the GMAT seems to really have been taken a hit from the GRE. A lot of business programs are taking the GRE now, accepting the GRE, and I know of some programs who waive the GMAT requirement for their own students who wish to get MBAs. So GMAT enrollments have plummeted, and I think GRE is a big part of that.
And GMAT's also, I think, probably harder than the GRE. It actually contains some LSAT style questions, like with the critical reasoning.
I think that data sufficiency item type.
Yeah, I love data sufficiency.
That's a stroke of genius. Yeah, I really like that. Yeah, you can take questions that you can form a question out of concepts that a third grader can understand and make it devilishly difficult. So yeah, I think that's a good test. Yeah.
Yeah, for those who aren't aware, the data sufficiency, I believe, is asking you whether you have enough information to solve a problem aside from simply just solving it straightforwardly. Yeah,
they'll give you a question, a yes/no question, or a question whose answer is a number, and they give you two statements, and you have to figure out whether statements alone or in combination are sufficient to answer that question uniquely. Yeah.
Yeah, very cool stuff. Very cool stuff. Now, to bring back to the LSAT for a moment, it seems that it's tougher than these other exams in a lot of ways. And for that reason, we like it more and think it's a better indicator of what law school is like and what work as a lawyer may be like. Now, it does test some aptitude, but it's also learnable to some extent. What do you think? What do you think about that?
Folks who aren't taking the LSAT within the next few months, one of the things that I recommend that they do is consider, most universities have this, a freshman level intro to philosophy class called reasoning and critical thinking or some such. I think that's the closest thing to an academic class that is LSAT prep as you're going to find. And if I tell folks, figure out what book they're using in that class. Go to the library and pick any book within 6 feet of it that looks interesting to you. I think it is actually very learnable. A lot of this stuff. It's funny. It's learnable. There's no thing that you learn like organic chemistry, but there are things that you learn how to do. So another thing I like to say, it's a know how rather than a know that test. The LSAT is. It's very can you do this rather than what do you know. And I think those skills are skills that you can pick up, you can learn pretty easily.
Yeah, definitely. And taking only a single class or even just reading the books on the side certainly wouldn't constitute much of any hit to one's GPA if it ended up being more than they bargained for.
Right. Absolutely.
Is there a particular book in that category that you like to recommend, or just anything in that category you think is pretty decent?
It's been a long time since I had to teach a class in that stuff, but and I don't even know if this book is still in print. But a book that I really liked back in the day, it was by a guy named John Nolt, called Informal Logic: Possible Worlds in Imagination. And when I think about logical reasoning myself, a lot of the framework from that book is what I use in my heuristics, et cetera, for explaining what a counterexample is, et cetera, how to strengthen an inference. I thought that book was very, very helpful in that regard.
Oh, thanks for that. I'll look it up and include a link to it in the description for this episode. I'm sure that there are some used copies floating around there online. And
I'm sure there are probably 20 or 30 just like it out there now. There is that is something of a cottage industry, cranking out these informal logic textbooks. They tend to be among the most popular philosophy classes out there, I think. So yeah, I'm sure there are lots of them that are just as good.
Yeah, there's one I really like called A Rule Book for Arguments by Anthony Weston. It's kind of like Elements of Style by Strunk and White, but for logic. Like it's like only like 110 pages, something like that. Really just boils logical fallacies down to their essence and kind of walks you through the basics. But yeah, there's so many like that. They're kind of addictive, because it's kind of like you get this little book and you just kind of know everything.
Right, and people say which one's the best, and I say, well, the one that you like to read is the best one. A lot of them are going to give you the same information, just packaged in different ways, and the one that's easiest for you to work with, I think, is the best one.
Yeah, definitely. To bring it back to LSAT for a moment with games, I'm wondering if you've noticed something at all about these recent games that have been appearing in the last 5 or so years, tests numbered in the 70s and 80s, where they kind of throw you these curveballs. They kind of harken back to the oldest logic games, like in the first 10 prep tests, where there aren't as many upfront inferences one can make. Have you noticed that?
I've noticed a couple things. There's this equivalent rule item, right? They've replaced an item type with this, and students really struggle with this equivalent rule question type. In the last 10 or 15 tests, there have been a couple of games that really were sort of throwbacks to things that you would see in the first 20 tests or so. I don't know what to make of that. I don't know that that really requires a shift in focus or emphasis for most students. The curveballs are so infrequent, it seems to me, that it's hard really to spend a lot of time planning for them, other than just to be aware of what they've done recently. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that, I guess, the category of curveball is kind of a hazy category to define, because you could loosely define it as being anything weird at all, or you could define it more strictly as maybe games with only 2 rules or 3 rules and very few, if any, upfront deductions one can make. I think some of these curveball games, though, relate to like pattern types of games where you're kind of recycling or repeating a certain flow, but more over the course of the game rather than making enormous upfront inferences. Like, for example, the games in the 30s, the prep tests numbered in the 30s from the early 2000s, which were completely different, which were much more in the way of deductive reasoning upfront.
So it seems to me that tests in the 30s, 40s, and 50s were way more likely to contain games with 2 group conditional rule games, in, out, in the class, out of the class, 2 group, conditional rule games. It seems to me that some of those tests had 2 of them, whereas now you see 1 every 2 or 3 tests. So that's something I definitely have noticed. Then games where you have sequences of sequences, maybe, where you're rearranging things in an order from one sequence to another. So ordering on ordering in some weird way. I'm always amazed at what they can do with such limited expressive resources in the game section. That really, it's only grouping, ordering, or both. That's it, and it's amazing what they can do with that. The variety of things they can do with that.
Yeah, and just 100 or 200 words, they're able to jam pack so much information. It really is incredible.
Yeah, and that really is an art, I think. Writing those games, that really is an art. So yeah, that's something special.
Okay, before we wrap up, I've just got one final question for you. And I know that we've touched on this a bit in the past, but with the LSAT being offered more frequently and LSAC having to reuse all these old test forms, do you think they'll ultimately be able to crank up production of test forms so that they're not reusing old ones, old unreleased ones quite as frequently?
I would imagine so. I would think so. They only have to double their production. And they would, we're only talking about a few hundred LR questions a year. It's not that many. So I would imagine that that's their plan. Yeah. To crank up the production so that that's not an issue.
And so you suspect they'd still be able to release or publish 3 test forms a year as they have been?
I'm hoping it'll be more than that.
That would be nice.
What is it? 7 administrations now? 6 or 7? I've lost track.
Yeah. So, I think it's not totally clear, but it's going to be something on the order of 9 or 10 total per year.
Once they get them all.
Yeah. So I think even starting now, like this year, we've had January, March, June, July,
right,
October, November. But then looking ahead to 2020, it's going to be virtually almost every month. Almost every month. But yeah, I'm thinking, if they could release 6 per year instead of 3, that would be something. But I just wonder it's kind of funny because I think back to the GMAT where they barely release any of them, right? You just have these official guides that are 500 or so or 700 pages thick, but that's it. That's all you get.
There's more care in the production of LSATs than anything else. It's just amazing how much care those tests get compared to the other ones I'm familiar with. So it wouldn't surprise me if they continue to make most of these test forms available. That transparency, I think, is especially since you tend to get litigious folks who take the LSAT. I haven't figured this out. That transparency, I think, is very much part of the PR battle that LSAC's trying to wage with the test too.
Yeah, well, it's nice. They do really stand by their test questions. I remember I've emailed them in the past, and I know a lot of other LSAT instructors have as well, asking for clarification on a particular item, and they might take a little while to get back to you. But when they get back to you, they're giving you like a couple thousand words or more, explaining in detail their exact thought process and justification for why the credited response is what it is. It really is remarkable.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, lot of really smart people put a lot of work into that test. Yeah.
Yeah, incredible respect for what they do, and it's great to have connected with you today, since you were at least part of the process of making these test forms happen.
Yeah, I'm really glad I had that opportunity. I'm glad I'm not doing that anymore, though. I'm happy to be on this side of the test with you, Steve.
Yeah, now you're helping out folks. Yeah, prepare instead, helping the students.
Right, we're much more popular at Thanksgiving dinners, Steve, on this side of the test than the other side.
Right. Helping folks beat the test. Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Steve, it was a pleasure. Any final words you want to share? Anything you want to plug? This is your opportunity. Whatever you'd like to share with anyone.
Not really. Enjoyed it, Steve. It's always a pleasure, and look forward to doing this again sometime.
All right. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, we'll talk soon.